Welcome everybody to the Berlin Climate Security online conference hosted by the International Crisis Group. My name is Nazanin Mashiri and I'm a senior analyst for ICG based in Nairobi in Kenya. We're here today to discuss climate change's destabilising impact, which is increasingly visible across the globe with more frequent and severe weather events and temperature extremes contributing to insecurity and conflict. Now, while climate change's relationship with conflict is really complex, context-specific, areas experiencing instability, poor governance and poverty tend to be more vulnerable to both climate change and deadly violence. And we do see this particularly here in the Horn of Africa, where we are right now. Half of the most climate fragile countries also experience conflict. So in order to effectively address this volatile mix, what's really important is that we have climate policy, financing that takes into account these conflict dynamics. And this panel that we are hosting today is going to investigate how to do it in terms of both climate change's relationship to conflict and the challenges that climate insecurity poses to humanitarian relief. So I'm really pleased to say that we have three excellent experts who are here to help us navigate these immense challenges and look at how we can manage the risks through early warning systems and other key tools as well. Chris Funk, who's on the panel today, is a director of the Climate Hazards Center at the University of Santa Barbara. He works with an international team of earth scientists to inform weather and famine-related disaster responses. Chris studies climate and climate change while also developing improved data sets and monitoring prediction systems. In 2020, Chris and Shraj Shukla published a book on drought early warning and forecasting. In 2021, Cambridge Press published Chris's Drought, Flood, Fire, How Climate Change Contributes to Catastrophes. So while his research interests are quite diverse, a central theme uniting Chris's work is developing both the technical as well as scientific resources and the conceptual frameworks that will help us cope with increasingly dangerous climate and weather extremes. Our second panelist today is Dr. Linda Agallo. She's a climate change adaptation expert at EGAD's Climate Prediction and Application Center and has supported the region in climate proofing extension services and increasing the access of climate information to the last mile user. Linda is a well-known authority on climate change, adaptation and sustainable development in the Greater Horn of Africa, having published many policy papers and peer-reviewed journal articles over the last 15 years. Her organization, EGAD, of course, was created by the African Union in 1986 as a regional economic community to provide timely, early warning climate information and strategies for coping with crop yields and other uncertainties associated with climate variability. Linda heads a climate security agenda at the specialized institution. Linda also holds a PhD in climate change and adaptation from the University of Nairobi. Her focus of study was on understanding the role of charcoal production in the context of changing climate. And finally, Dr. Kwesi Senkulot-Greenridge is the Conflict and Access Advisor at the World Food Programme. With over 15 years experience in the area of policy, analysis and governance, along with a PhD focusing on conflict resolution, Kwesi's focus has been helping developing states reach their full potential through the sustainable management of conflict and natural resources, along with innovative governance models. Kwesi's work and research has spanned Africa, the Caribbean Sea Basin, the Ghanas, and the Pacific Islands. So we have a large audience here today, I'm happy to say, joining us from all over the world. Thanks so much for joining in. Since this is a webinar, you'll not be able to turn on the video or microphones, but you can post your questions in the Q&A, and we're going to have some time towards the end to put some of the questions to the panelists. Please highlight perhaps whom you'd like to question in your question when you post it. And also, just to let you know, this session is going to be recorded and hopefully will be posted on the Adelphi website tomorrow, and it's also going to be on YouTube as well. So let's start with Chris. Chris, can you briefly elaborate on the magnitude of what we're seeing right now in terms of this ongoing unprecedented drought in the Horn as a scientist and food security expert?
Yeah, thank you, Nanzanine, for your question and the opportunity to participate in the panel today. As you know, I've really spent more than 20 years working with the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, specifically to develop data sets to answer this question. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is an incredibly unprecedented drought in the Eastern Horn of Africa. And this drought is really exceptional in 4 different ways. First of all, it has been very repetitive. And we've seen failed rains in October, November, December of 2020, March, April, May of 2021, October, November, December of 2021, and then March, April, May of 2022. And as you probably are experiencing in Nairobi, we're very likely to see the failure of a 5th season. And we're also quite concerned about the next season in March, April, May 2023. That kind of sequence of at least 5 below normal rains has never happened before in the historical record, which goes back with pretty good accuracy to about 1950. And the chance of that happening, randomly is vanishingly small. Then the drought has been incredibly intense, especially the last poor rainy season in March, April, May of 2022, which we can say with a 95% confidence level was the driest March, April, May going back to 1950, incredibly dry. And then the drought has been incredibly hot. And those temperatures that are going up due to climate change, are adding to the desiccation of vegetation and water supplies, increasing heat stress on livestock and human beings. And then finally, the drought in March, April, May was the most extensive on record, which for us goes back to 1980 because of the limits with satellites. So it's been really horrendous. And it really looks like we're in the middle of a 5th poor season.
Thanks, Chris. We'll come back to you in a moment, but I just wanted to follow up with Kwesi on this issue. Obviously, World Food Programme being at the forefront of trying to assist people on the ground across the Horn region. Kwesi, the picture that Chris painted there was pretty bleak. What do you see in terms of the links between what Chris has been saying about what's on the horizon and what's happening now, and the kind of political and conflict dynamics that you're seeing as well on the ground in the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, I think thanks so much. First of all, thanks so much for having me here today. I think Chris has painted an incredibly bleak, but also an incredibly accurate picture of what's actually taking place in the Eastern Horn of Africa. Currently, the drought in the Horn of Africa has left 22 million people food insecure, which when we think of the scale of this is larger than a number of countries globally. The needs are far exceeding the ability of us to cope with it. One of the key challenges that we're also seeing is this interconnection between food insecurity, climate, and conflict. Now, this is not necessarily a direct causal link, but what we're seeing is a situation where climate is weakening already stretched coping mechanisms, where the climate crisis that we're seeing is forcing more and more people away from rural areas where they may have coping mechanisms into urban and semi-urban areas that just don't have the infrastructure to cope with the level of population growth or bulge that they've seen in the last period. In certain parts, particularly in southern Somalia as well as in northern Kenya, entire communities have lost their livestock. Those who have been able to hold on to what livestock they have are congregating around the few water points that are left, and this is increasing conflict. So what we're seeing is not a direct causal relationship between climate change and conflict, but rather a weakening of social bonds, a weakening of coping mechanisms, and an inability in some places for both local levels of authority as well as central governments to cope with the scale of what is taking place. So I think this is, as Chris said, a kind of a generational crisis that we're seeing here, one which has been recurrent, but I think what it has done is it has basically degraded the ability of communities to cope with what has happened. So this now our fourth failed consecutive rainy season is really pushing communities to the brink.
And Linda, if you'd just like to come in there, just picking up on what Kwesi said there about this unprecedented drought, but also, the flooding we've seen in South Sudan as well, in other parts of Ethiopia and even parts of Kenya. These kind of climate extremes that we're seeing. How concerned is IGAD about the impact of what we're seeing on livelihoods and what that means for security?
IGAD has been at the forefront in trying to address or at least bring attention at the highest levels. During the failure of the last season, we had the heads of state of IGAD come together to address or at least talk about or highlight the food security crisis. We've had several ministerial meetings specifically to address the food security crisis as it's gotten worse and worse. The last one being about a week ago. So from a leadership standpoint, there's a lot of concern from our member states in terms of how this is impacting communities on the ground. And even talking about, as we talk about issues of resilience, as we talk about issues of adaptation, the shift is now coming to where the kind of risk we're seeing now is what we haven't seen before. So even the tools that we've given communities for adaptation were never for 5 failed rainfall seasons. So you're dealing with communities who do not have the ability to survive 2 rainfall seasons, failed rainfall season, let alone 5. So it's from an IGAD perspective, from an institutional perspective, who've been dealing with adaptation of resilience, the word risk is taking on a new meaning as we begin to see unprecedented. Almost seems like every year we have something unprecedented. So it's not only compounded drought. Before the drought began, we were dealing with desert locusts on top of the pandemic. And then before that, we had extreme flooding within the same areas. So it's shock after shock after shock after shock. And the kind of adaptation strategies that we have been teaching and we have been trying to institute for local communities has not been for the extent of the kind of shocks that we're seeing right now. And even as our member states, we're beginning to talk about how do we begin to look at things differently? How can we understand how to help communities, how to build the institutions in order to give the communities what they need?
Before we move on to those discussions over solutions, challenges, et cetera, I just want to come back to Chris briefly. And Chris, it would be interesting, I think, for our audience to understand perhaps what areas in particular would you say, because the Horn is a huge region. What areas in particular would you say should we be focusing in on more because we're seeing more of a risk of drought and dryness, or perhaps other kind of climate shocks like flooding in those particular areas?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. And I think I can follow up on Linda's comments as well. So one of the sort of obvious areas to start with, is the Eastern Horn sector. And it's a very unique area of the world because it's really tightly linked to sea surface temperature variations in the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. which creates a high degree of climate volatility. And, Linda is, of course, 100% right that there's been these sequential shocks. And if you go back to October, November, December of 2016, and then the following year, there was another drought, and then there was famine in Somalia. Well, since that October, November, December, there's been something like 9 dry seasons. There's been 4 exceptionally wet seasons and desert locust outbreaks, and only 2 normal seasons. So it's been this big increase in climate volatility. But, most of those extreme events were associated with, well understood, modes of climate variability like El Niños and La Niñas and Indian Ocean dipole events, and exceptionally warm sea surface temperatures due to climate change. And they offer a really high degree of predictability. And so the challenge is, how can that information be used? I think a compelling example of that is that in May of this year, ICPAC and partners like the Famine Early Warning System and WMO, released a really exceptional alert saying that we all were concerned about poor outcomes in October, November, December of 2022. So that's an incredibly, advanced and early warning. But how can that information be used to reduce conflict and insecurity is a big challenge.
Yeah, so let's talk about that challenge. I think our audience will be really interested in trying to understand, what the challenges and shortcomings are. And Kwesi, I'd like to come to you first. Obviously, for WFP is extremely important as a humanitarian organization on the front line of many humanitarian challenges, conflict challenges, to have an adequate early warning system. But what would you say, as somebody who's working on this day in, day out, what would you say are the main shortcomings and challenges in these systems?
I think, first of all, we've come an incredibly long way in terms of predictive analysis. We're able to tell quite well where we will have shortfalls, both in terms of rainfall, as well as in terms of disruption to crop patterns, disruption to markets, and things like this. So the science is getting much better at predicting where we will see shocks. The problem is twofold. One is that it is still incredibly difficult to mobilize early action. As we've seen with the Horn of Africa, East African drought, as we've seen with the droughts and possible famine in Somalia, we've seen a slow pickup in terms of how we're able to provide assistance. Part of this is because of the scale. The sheer scale of the crisis means that even when predicted, the levels of funding, the levels of pipeline and mobilization needed take some time. We've seen, particularly in this crisis, distractions caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So we've had a slow international uptake in that. Also seen some degrees of donor fatigue, where crisis in Ethiopia, conflict in Somalia, the desert locust, now the drought, has made it quite difficult for donors to get that tight focus that's needed on this. So that's one side of the issue. The other side, and I think this is a deeper problem here, has to do with a little bit with the structure of the way that humanitarian funding is currently allocated. So we have got situations where some of these populations may be going into their 8th season of displacement, maybe going into their 8th year of being food insecure, and they're still currently under the humanitarian caseload when this is well beyond an emergency humanitarian setting. The question becomes, how do we then rebalance some of the humanitarian funding that allows us to be more flexible in terms of how we address these challenges? One of the things I think to bear in mind, again, by what we've heard from Linda and what we've heard from Chris, one of the things that worries us is that large parts of the Eastern Horn, where you've had large degrees of both water and food insecurity, The question becomes, what happens to these populations in the long term? Some of these areas may become permanently uninhabitable. They may require development and humanitarian assistance for periods of time that the international community is unable to sustain because of other climate challenges. So in some ways, the question for an organization like the UN and like WFP in particular becomes, how do we shock-proof some of the gains that we've made in the last 2 or 3 decades, particularly around the development side? How do we shock-proof those gains so that when we do see these climatic shocks, when we do see these conflict shocks, that we're not starting from scratch in some of these areas where communities lost all that they may have invested in the last 2 or 3 decades. One final point, and I guess around the challenges, is that while we have a large caseload of climate-induced displacement and people who are food insecure because of climate change, 83% of the needs in the Eastern Africa region are driven by conflict. Now, we are not at the level of sophistication yet where we can disaggregate which of those conflicts are caused by climate shocks or by climate change, but there is still a huge mismatch in this region where a large degree of our food insecurity are caused by conflict. I'm sure that a large portion of the underlying causes of that conflict is probably climate change in itself or some climate-induced conflict. So I think we're grappling with a number of issues here. One, structural issues within the humanitarian and development system. We're grappling with the scale of this crisis, and we're also grappling with the long-term viability of the current approach.
Yeah, very interesting point, sir, especially about how to shock-proof the gains that you've made, as humanitarian organizations. And as you mentioned there, overwhelmingly, a lot of the displacement we're seeing is driven by conflict. So my next question to you, Kwesi, is we want to be able to predict, of course, as early as possible, where and how this extreme weather is going to hit. But how can we then connect that to preventing violence or the risk of violence in some cases?
I think this is really the key question. And we're trying a number of approaches as humanitarian actors, particularly as WFP and other UN partners. So one set of approaches is understanding what communities value in terms of peace and security. What does that mean to a particular community in a particular part of South Sudan or in Somalia? Then the question becomes, how do we enhance that everyday peace, the social cohesion part of it, to ensure that when there is conflict or when there is a shortfall in terms of rainfall patterns, that the communities are buffered against these challenges. This is actually quite difficult because it takes a level of localization of local knowledge. As was said by previous speakers, climate change is affecting the region in very, very variable patterns. The second area in which WFP is investing in heavily is the understanding that while conflict change affects all of us, it affects different groups quite specifically. And those are, of course, pastoral communities and women and girls who are, of course, the most hard hit by the conflict that may come from climate change. So part of what we're trying to do is to ensure that when we do infrastructure, when we do access to natural resources, be that water, be that improved pastures, that we leave those communities with a conflict management structure, that we support either local level conflict management, or we support trainings for leadership, women, men, youth in the community, so that they can manage these productive resources after the UN and WFP leaves. So that is one layer of it, where we're trying to ensure that at least more than doing no harm, we're trying to be conflict sensitive in our work. The other part, and I think this is a little bit more difficult, again goes back to the question around early action. We've got a lot of information and a lot of data that tells us where we will have shortfalls. We are trying to layer that data with data around migration routes for pastoral communities. We're trying to lay that in terms of farming cycles and farming patterns. We're trying to lay that data also on top of data around conflict displacement, where populations go to, so we can be there preemptively. So we can be there with the physical infrastructure, so we can be there with the soft skills for communities, so that when they do face these shocks, they do have some fallback mechanisms and some kind of communal safety nets that have been supported by a wide range of actors. So we're trying a number of different approaches, but bearing in mind that climate change, while affecting us all, is affecting vulnerable groups quite differently from it affects the others. In that vulnerable category, I would of course put in the urban poor, who are uniquely vulnerable to climate shocks and the impact that conflict has on those communities.
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming message, Kwesi, as you know, when I was in Baidoa and in Dolo in southern Somalia, southern Somalia, of course, is facing the prospect of famine in 2 districts in Bay region. The overwhelming message was that, we have safety now, we've escaped the conflict, and we're starting to get some assistance, but we don't have livelihoods. And that was one of the messages that came out from speaking to many of the people who've been displaced. But I want to come to you, Linda. We're talking about early warning here in particular at the moment, and I know that your department does a lot of work in terms of prediction, early warning, climate adaptation, and also CWARN as well, which is another department connected to IGAD. They also do conflict early warning as well, and they have a lot of data and information. But one of the messages you hear on the ground, many communities, when you speak to people, is that they're not perhaps getting that information. I mean, who do you think is responsible, or who should be responsible for taking that good data, that good information that would be very useful to people, and using it to work directly with affected communities?
Thank you, Nazanin. I think you've touched on it a lot. We do produce a lot of material in terms of early warning. We have a hazard center that specifically focuses on disasters. We work with CWARN, and we also have a livestock institute specifically that looks at transhumance routes and offers services for pastoralists. We have a lot going on even in the peace and security sector. And the challenge I know has been, I think Dr. Kwesi touched a lot on what's happening within the humanitarian sector, but the response has largely been donor-based and with the humanitarian actors, and there hasn't a lot been put into building institutional infrastructure. So what happens is we produce a lot of information and papers at the global level about the Horn of Africa. We produce very good information and charts at the regional level. It might get to the national level in some countries. It might get stuck in the national level at some countries, and then it does not trickle down to the subnational level because there's no institutional infrastructure at that level. And then you go all the way to the community level. There's absolutely nothing that's connecting them from the global all the way to the last mile user. So because the drive is largely being driven by the humanitarian sector, so we're basically producing good information for NGOs, but as long as we don't invest in the institutional infrastructure, and what the humanitarian sector is telling us right now is that the need cannot be dealt with just from a humanitarian perspective. We have to begin to support the member states in this region to begin to be able to not just think short term, which is what we have been doing. We've been very reactionary in how we deal with disasters, and it's showing in many other ways, because poverty is one of the huge ones that's driving both the vulnerability to climate change, because even in these areas where we're having climate extremes, those who have money to adapt, to move, to buy food are not being impacted. It's those who are poor who cannot be able to adapt. And it's the same thing with poverty, with conflict. A lot of the conflict drivers are largely because people are not able to get what they want. People are poor, so they fight to get what they think that they need. So a lot of these inequalities are in a lot of ways interlinked. And because we're not dealing with it from a systemic perspective, then we're not getting to the core issues. Because if the local governments do not have the knowledge, they do not have the capacity, if there is no system on how this information is getting to the end users, if the government itself, which is the biggest challenge in Africa, because you have a lot of disasters happening in the West, but you don't need humanitarian aid to then go and respond, because the government has safety nets. The government is able to provide something for the families, but for the African governments, there's not a lot being put into building systems, into ensuring that these systems are in place such that when something happens in a disaster, they know what to do. So we've not even begun to talk about climate change in terms of the future risks. So what is to happen to these communities and these governments if we are unable to handle the current risks in a climate that's getting worse? What does the future look like for us? So I think there needs to be a lot more investment in institutional infrastructure, in policies that work on the ground, such that this stops being just a humanitarian issue, but like Dr. Kwesi said, looking at the developmental angles, how can we help these communities get out of poverty? How can we help them have better safety nets such that the response to, which actually when you go to a lot of these areas, when you ask them, well, how do you respond to climate change? The answer becomes aid, or the answer becomes humanitarian actors. So how do we make it such that this is not, the response to climate crisis is not aid, but they have certain things that they can go to before they get to needing the humanitarian actors. So essentially, how can we work ourselves out of a job, basically?
Interesting. And you mentioned there, of course, the big D, donors and financing, which is always crucial. What kind of financing do you think, and what kind of multilateral architecture is needed, is required to meet these needs, to kind of bridge the gap between what you're saying, which is, have the data collection, which is pretty good at IGAD, and getting that information to people who need it, and then also developing, livelihoods and sustainable climate adaptation?
I think Chris mentioned it a little bit about the need for data. And there's been a lot actually in Africa in terms of acknowledging the need to invest in automatic weather stations. We've seen a lot that's been done with WMO right now. They want to expand the observation sites. We've seen African Union as well is putting a lot of investment in increasing the observation. And that will go a long way in terms of improving the global models to be able to give better predictions, which is kind of the challenge, especially with the March to May rainfall. So that is one thing that is important in how do we strengthen our national METs. And then we also need to think about the private sector. I think there's a lot of resources, and in Africa, we talk about adaptation when it comes to the climate change conversation, which is extremely important. But the one thing that we as Africans have not yet brought to the negotiating table is on the need for finances for mitigation. For example, Africa has one of the largest growing populations. I think that about 3% of annual population growth in Africa, while most of the world has a declining population rate. So the future of energy is basically in Africa. And this has to be done in a way that doesn't cause more harm. We're already not being able to cope with the impact of emissions that has been done up to date. And we're saying as an African nation, in order to get out of this vulnerability, we need to get out of energy poverty, we need to increase energy access. And in a lot of ways, this cannot come from the donor perspective, because we do need to do that in our national determined contributions. We need to include some of these things in a national determined contributions. But if you look at the global climate finance that is available and what Africa needs to adapt and what Africa needs to develop, it's just not there. So we have to begin to think about including the private sector. We have to think about even what kind of investment is there in the people themselves, because the people do have a lot to offer, but sometimes we tend to look at these communities as recipients and not so much as looking at the capacity of what they have to bring to the table. So I think it's not just about ensuring that we have all our wish list in our NDCs or going to the climate conference and negotiating. We have to begin as African nations, African people, to think about what do we have in our hand and how can we make it go as far as it can? How can we improve on it? How can we change the different financial mechanisms to ensure that we're capitalizing on the private sector we're capitalizing on the capital that we have, which is people. And how can we be a bit more forward thinking? How can we embrace technology to leapfrog some of the challenges that the West went through when it comes to development? But it has to be looking at development as a priority, looking at mitigation as a priority, as much as we're talking about adaptation.
Yeah, and of course, those issues are going to be high on the agenda at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which is coming up very, very soon. I just wanted to come back to you, Chris, and just, I mean, you've been listening into Kwesi and Linda with their great analysis and thoughts on the shortcomings and challenges that we're facing in this field. As somebody who obviously is looking at this from a scientific perspective, what opportunities do you see in terms of how science can improve matters, can improve operations, can help deal with these kind of shortcomings and challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, thank you, Nazanin. And I think, you know, as a starting point, you know, I think we need to recognize, as has been discussed many times, that climate change is making, you know, more climate volatility. You know, so since 1997, we've had 8 El Niños, 13 La Niñas, 8 Indian Ocean dipole events in just 25 years. So there's a lot of things happening all the time that, you know, that people can use to make forecasts, and that information can then be shared by people like Linda, you know, via climate services to guide, you know, improved decision making. But, you know, I think as Linda stated really well, you know, right now, most of that information is just being used to guide retroactive humanitarian assistance, which Dr. Kwesi talked about as well. But if you kind of pull back and think about the Horn of Africa and food security, you know, the thing that drives, you know, food insecurity most directly, you know, is the gap between food prices and incomes, right? You know, as Amartya Sen taught us, it's like famine is economic. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for using, you know, improved climate services, you know, at the localized level to increase crop productivity, which can, you know, help suppress prices, which would, you know, it doesn't have, you know, like, for example, in these kinds of climate change enhanced La Niñas that we're experiencing now, there's a very predictable signal of wetter conditions in northern Ethiopia. So this year they had a ton of rain up there, and that created an opportunity for enhanced crop production, you know, which could be producing grain that would be shipped to Kenya this year to help make up for the deficits. And so, you know, if there's a drought one place, typically there's enhanced rain someplace else. And so there are opportunities for, you know, the intensification of agriculture in a climate smart way. I think that could make a big difference. I mean, you know, it's sort of a root level. The Horn of Africa is food insecure because it doesn't produce enough food. And, you know, there's a lot of opportunity there.
And that's a great example there, Chris. I'd just like to take that to Kwesi, because I think that's just really, really key. If we have made significant advances in climate forecasting, thanks to the work that Chris is doing and the work that Linda's doing in recent years. But then how can we get that information to decision makers to kind of focus in on those areas like northern Ethiopia? Obviously, there's conflict ongoing there, but parts of the region where there isn't conflict, where perhaps crop production could then be used to sort of deal with food insecurity elsewhere. How can we get that kind of information to people who make decisions on these things?
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point that Chris has brought up here, that you've highlighted here, Nazanin. I think the price of what we call a basket of food products in Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa has, of course, increased because of the conflict in Ukraine. but we've seen an increasing trend really since the 2007 food price spike. So it's been going up rather slowly with now a huge spike as a result of Ukraine. What does this mean for fragile contexts, particularly like the Horn of Africa? Well, one, Chris has highlighted some of it. It means that we need to support governments. We need to support RECs with localization of crops. This is in terms of the choice of crops that people are using, but also in terms of which crops are grown where. We've got a mismatch in some areas where crops that were brought across either by colonialism or by other means are grown in areas where they might not be most suited. So part of it is reconfiguring this. Second is understanding the impact that humanitarian and development actors have on the food system as a whole. And in order to understand this, WFP embarked on a study last year, we call it the Louis study, that looks at the impact of our purchasing power in Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa. And what this study showed is that for every dollar WFP spends in this region, we're getting a $1.60 return on investment. And that means that we've got traders, we've got producers, we've got growers, we've got women marketers who all benefit from WFP purchasing humanitarian supplies largely, but also development supplies in this region, rather than trying to get them from places farther afield. So one is understanding our ability to support this kind of economic growth. Secondly is also trying to be a bit more targeted in what we do. So at WFP, we're trying to ensure that a large percentage of what we're purchasing comes from women farmers. It's produced locally, and that it's produced in a way that is sustainable. So we're trying to ensure that we're able to tick these boxes, even while trying to reach those who are most in need. So this is kind of the mindset shift that we're witnessing within certain parts of the humanitarian and development actors as they try to move ahead. I guess the question for me, and this is something that's hinted at again by Chris, is why are we speaking about the Horn of Africa and East Africa? Again, because we've got a number of different factors that coalesce here in this particular region in ways that they don't in other parts of the world. So we've got a mixture of a high population of pastoralists relative to the rest of the population. If you look at countries like South Sudan, you look at Sudan, you look at Somalia, these are some of the countries with the highest proportion of pastoralists globally. We've got vulnerability to climate shocks also in this area. We've got in many areas quite conscribed governments that are quite strong in capitals. So we've just got something passing overhead. That are quite strong in capitals, but then much weaker in the rural areas. So this comes together in a way that makes communities incredibly vulnerable to shocks, be they conflict, be they climate. So part of what we're trying to do as WFP is understand how these shocks impact the population, how we can buffer them against them, and how we can use the science produced by the likes of Dr. Gallo as well as Chris to ensure that we've got the support that we need for those vulnerable communities. So it's a multi-pronged approach that involves us both working on the humanitarian and development side of the nexus.
Just staying with you briefly, Kwesi, obviously, you just touched a little bit on the situation in the Horn. Of course, we have an ongoing conflict in Ethiopia, and we have millions of people who are not being reached or can't be reached in, for example, in Tigray region. And as you mentioned there in Somalia, we have a situation in the central and southern part of Somalia where we have, urban areas which are controlled by either the federal government or federal member states. But many of the rural areas are under the control of the militant group Al-Shabaab, which has links to Al-Qaeda. So in terms of the work that WFP does, these operational risks really do hinder your work, right, in fragile contexts. So in a way, early warning systems that look at, both the climatic stresses and the kind of political conflict dynamics would be extremely useful for you to have that kind of localized information and knowledge to try to, I guess, mitigate some of those operational risks.
And I think this is perhaps the reason, well, not perhaps, this is the reason why WFP has embarked on such a strong partnership with both Adelphi as well as the International Crisis Group, to allow us to get that level of analysis, political analysis, climate science analysis, so that we know not only what is coming, but also a little bit how to deal with it. So for instance, the way this works is, for instance, in a case like Somalia, where we may be imminently approaching a declaration of famine, WFP's response there has been largely in cash, because our analysis and the analysis of our partners has shown that the markets are still able to sustain people at this point in time, and that a cash-based response is what is needed. In other parts, in other areas, for instance, in South Sudan, in Western Sudan itself, we've had an in-kind-based response that is mainly based on food baskets or food products. But the analysis that we conduct both internally, as well as the climate science that we get from Adelphi and the political analysis that we get in partnership with ICG, allows us to right-size our response in these different areas, and also allows us to be incredibly flexible. The risk that we're seeing in this particular region, and I guess globally, is a narrowing of the humanitarian space, a lack of adherence to humanitarian principles by all parties to conflict in this region, particularly those who should know better. We see a use of food as a weapon of war, and we see the willingness by conflict parties to induce massive levels of suffering on civilian populations from other communities. This is rapidly becoming, I wouldn't say the norm, but the barriers to this being used in conflict, I think, are breaking down, particularly in this part of the world, but also wider afield as we see elsewhere. So the question for humanitarians globally becomes, how do we regain some of this space? How do we ensure that member states, that governments, that non-state armed groups all adhere to the principles that they may have signed on to, or that are universally recognized as rights and responsibilities of actors in conflict? There's no easy answer to this question, but what we see is that when we don't stand up for these positions as humanitarian actors, the space narrows to the point where we're unable to reach those in need.
Thank you. We've got an audience listening in, of course. This is being recorded as well by Adelphi, and it's going to be on YouTube. At this point, before we move on to the next part of our discussion, I wanted to bring in a couple of questions from our audience. There's one question here for Linda Gallo from Diego Osorio about the institutional infrastructure and the top humanitarian framework for information. Basically, I think Diego's asking what can be done to create grassroots community practice, and how can we make these kinds of efforts, I guess, in terms of early warning, adaptation, how can we make them accessible and practical at the local level? I think you can answer that, Linda.
Thank you, Nazanin. I think we talked about this a bit earlier, how do we strengthen the local institutional infrastructure? And I think sometimes it's good to remember that a lot of these member states are pretty new. We're dealing with very young nations. And a lot of the Western civilizations have been around for hundreds of years. So that if you go through the historical records, they've kind of gone through the same growing pains that we are going through. And some of these things get resolved over time, because a lot of them, yes, we talk about issues of climate change, and we talk about the risks which are very real. But when it comes to issues of capacity, we can't ignore other social factors like education. We can't ignore issues of health and health institutions. So as time progresses, and if you've been working in Somalia long enough, and you looked at the kind of leadership that was there during the transitional federal government, and then when Somalia finally got its government, and even with this one, and the level of educated experts that we're beginning to see from the government and the evolution of that, you begin to see more capacity as time and generations go by. So there's a lot of investment in people, investment in the local people, access to education, because the more that the local communities have access to education, the more that the women and girls are empowered, then some of these issues begin to resolve themselves naturally. And this is from the conflict side and also from the vulnerability side. So some of it is just giving nations time and support to grow naturally, the way the Western nations have, and having a bit of grace for these young nations to build their institutions, to build the capacity of the people, to build the educational systems, and to look at the other social factors that are surrounding or increasing our vulnerability, and just trusting, at least from my where I'm sitting, hoping that the future, as we evolve as people, as we increase access to education, as we increase the capacity of women and girls, as we evolve as African people, that some of these things will begin to resolve themselves just as they did in the West. But yes, it's important also to remember that we're still a young nation. South Sudan is very young. Somalia is so young, same as Kenya and the other nations. And some of the things that we're experiencing now are because we are still a young nation.
Thanks, Linda. And there's a question from Anne Moyson that perhaps, Chris, you could pick up on. Anne is asking what lessons can be taken away from what's happening in the Horn as climate extremes spread to other areas in Africa and beyond, as they're going to impact other countries with food insecurity, climate impacts, etc., if not leading to conflicts. I mean, she asked a question about increasing protests against governments, but just in terms of the climate science, maybe you could just give us a bit of a picture.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Nancy. And I think that there are two main pathways for climate change related risk. And the first and most universal one is just that air temperatures are getting warmer. And what we see all over the world is that has a really dangerous desiccating effect on vegetation, which we've seen in Germany, right, and in London, and Spain and California and all over the world. And that same warming air temperature also results in the fact that air can hold more water, and so that it also links back to things like more floods in South Sudan, more extreme tropical cyclones. And so that's a very universal, source of risk that is affecting everyone. And then there's a kind of more specific category of risk that we've talked about quite a bit today, which is, extreme sea surface temperatures in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and how volatile those have been. And, those affect not all of Africa, it would be more Eastern and Southern Africa, but we're certainly, seeing that play out as a source of risk that provides us opportunities for prediction. And, so for example, I've been having conversations with, colleagues in Southern Africa, trying to get people to start worrying about the next big El Nino, which might produce flooding in Nairobi, but that is associated with severe drought over Southern Africa. So this is, affecting, really billions of people, and we need to take it seriously. But if we recognize it, then we can improve our early warning systems, and that's really what we need to do.
Well, we're going to come back to, we've got some other questions from other members of the audience, one for Kwesi, and I think one maybe that I can answer, but I think we'll just pick up on what you just said about building early warning systems, because this is really key in the discussion that we're having right now. I mean, you've got a lot of experience, Chris, in building early warning systems. So what would ideally you like to see in an ideal world where you had all the funds necessary to build this system? What would you like to see happen, and how would it look, and how would it help people like Kwesi on the ground, governments, decision makers, and also people in communities as well?
Sure. And I would be pretty interested to see what Linda and Kwesi might have to say about this as well. I'm sure they have a wish list too. I mean, so that, you know, the first thing that I think to recognize with that question, Anzanine, is that I'm not qualified to answer it alone. You know, is that by the very nature of what we need to, you know, motivate effective action, as Linda really described well, at the, you know, local, subnational, and national level. You know, I don't know the questions that need to be answered. I know a lot about the resources that are out there from a weather and climate perspective, and you know, global institutions and, you know, research universities like where I'm at, you know, can provide a lot, and interact and collaboratively develop products. But then, you know, that really needs to be linked to, you know, subnational and local decision makers in effective ways in a dialogue. And, you know, I, as somebody who's, you know, worked on famine early warning systems networks for almost 25 years, you know, I know that those dialogues over time can produce, you know, really effective climate services. But it can't be done alone. You have to do it in conversation. And it's you know, we're facing a lot of challenges, but there's an incredible opportunity for us to work together across institutions and disciplines to combine, you know, our intelligences to solve these problems. And I think we can do that.
I mean, Linda, just if you'd like to pick up, I know that EGAD, as we've mentioned, is already doing some of this work, but how could you contribute more broadly to this question of building early warning systems that perhaps can then be disseminated more widely?
Ideally would be to support the member states to have a national framework of climate services, whether in the meantime is particularly for the very fragile states, taking advantage of the indigenous systems that are there, but having a formalized institutional system in which takes into consideration what the local context is, and regional information that is generated at the regional level can then flow all the way down to the community level. And then of course, an increased investment in the observation, because if the warnings are not accurate, then again, you lose the trust of the communities that you have. So there's that aspect of it. And then in an ideal situation, I would say building the capacity of communities to be able to not have to rely on rain-fed agriculture. Because in sub-Saharan Africa, we talk about 70% of the communities being in subsistence farming, relying on rain-fed agriculture, and we still have massive food security issues. While in a country like America, I think the statistics is about 2% of the population is in agriculture, and this 2% is able to provide food for the entire country and even export food. So how can we help our farmers move from rain-fed agriculture to more mechanized and industrialized approaches to agriculture, so that even the price of food and food commodities can go down? So how do we move from the reliance on rain-fed agriculture, and how can communities begin to, because some of the risks that communities face in terms of too much water, too little water, is not as harsh as even what we see in Southern Africa with the cyclones and the heavy flooding that you see there. So how can we help communities live or cope better? How can we help them industrialize? How can we help them have access to more energy so that they can be able to build factories, so that they can be able to let their future generations, because we're seeing a lot of, with migration, a lot of rural populations moving from to the urban areas, telling you that a lot of young people do not want to still be pastoralists, and they might not want to pursue subsistence farming. They might want to do it in a modernized way, but how can we ensure that rural communities have the opportunities to make that choice on whether they want to keep on doing subsistence farming, or having not have that as their only option, but having a different path, having their children have a different path? So ideally for me would be, one, how do we strengthen the systems that we already have? How do we build where there is lacking? And then at the end user base, how do we give the communities the dignity of not having to beg for food, the dignity of not having to take your child out of school and have them spend the whole day with the livestock because they have no other choice? So how do we give some of these local communities the dignity of choice that a lot of other communities in the developed world have?
Yeah, thank you for that, Linda. And David Maronda just made a comment about farmers coping with declining yields because of climate-related impacts like floods, reduced support on fertilizers, obviously because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and this perhaps increasing, the risk of conflicts in certain areas. So I think that's a very good point that David has made there. And just to come back to you, Kwesi, we're talking about early warning systems that include that kind of conflict, peace and security element as well, and not just the climate data. Do you think that would help fill the gap for humanitarian organizations like WFP, that gap between disaster risk management and peace and security in the regions that we're looking at?
I think that would be an incredible start for us. I think we are very cognizant of what we lack in terms of that analysis, in terms of that early warning and what's needed. It falls into kind of three broad categories if you look internally as to what's needed, and another three if you look externally. Internally, what is needed is that predictive science, that early warning, that research piece that allows us to have strong evidence-based research around the particular impacts that climate change will have in the various areas of the Horn of Africa, because these impacts are quite differentiated between different countries, between different sub-districts, and between different districts themselves. So one is to get that information. I think the second thing that is needed and what we've embarked on as WFP is a broader range of partners. So our ability to reach local communities needs to be revamped. We're looking to work with a new range of actors, the Adelphis, the crisis groups, but also at the incredibly local level. We're working more with women's groups on the ground. We're working more with local producers. We're working more with local transporters. So we're broadening our range of partnerships that allows us to understand, but also reach those that are most in need. And the final bit of this is our menu of options in terms of what we do to support local communities. When my regional director hates it when I say this, but when I joined WFP, I thought of them largely as pretty well-meaning truck drivers. But now you see a WFP that is technical, that has skills ranging from energy experts to deal with microgrids in refugee camps on one side. They've got conflict experts like myself on the other side, and that is increasing the menu of options that we have available for local communities. It allows us to be more nuanced in what we're recommending. It allows us to use the tools not only of WFP, but also of other partners within the UN, like UNEP, like FAO, but also within partners within academia, as well as within civil society. So I think broadening that menu of options is also something that's very, very important for us. What does this lead to? It leads to some pretty interesting outcomes, because it means that we can then be more deliberate as we target the most vulnerable. We can be precise in who needs to be reached and how they need to be reached. It means that in terms of understanding what is causing conflict, what are the impacts of climate change, we have a more granular understanding. So we're starting to develop we're moving away now from just being do no harm focused or doing conflict sensitive focus. We're actually trying to be peace positive. And we have some amazing examples of our work from South Sudan, where we've been able to implement some of these peace positive programming as WFP sees it. And then finally, we're able to work a bit more with member states in the sub-region because we understand a little bit better the challenges. So I think it was Chris who had spoken a little bit about so it was Linda actually who spoke about being able to cross borders, trans-border programming. We're looking to work with the member states to strengthen their ability to monitor, to track pastoralists as they move from one state to the next, that allows this movement to be seamless. We're doing the same for crops, so that in times of shortfall, countries can export more easily because they've got the mechanisms set up already, this governance architecture. So in these three ways, both internally and externally, I think this is how we use the early warning data a little bit more systematically, but also some of the areas where we still need to strengthen our work as well-meaning truck drivers here at WFP.
I don't want to put you on the spot here, but you mentioned a positive example in South Sudan. I think that our audience would like to hear a bit of positivity of something that's actually working. Maybe you could just expand a little bit on that example.
Yeah, I can briefly talk about this. What we've done in two areas, both in the Greater Pibor administrative area, as well as in Warab, is we have worked with local communities to first understand what it is they value in terms of peace, security, and social cohesion. So we spent an incredibly long time going deep into the Bomas and saying, what does peace look like to you? And we got some incredible answers from local communities. In one community, they said, it's the ability for my children and my cattle to sleep outdoor at night. Part of it was distilling this to understand what they actually meant. It was a feeling of security, a feeling that they understood not only the security force presence in the area, but also the other communities nearby, and that they were in a cohesive position with them. What we understood this to be was this was a broader need for security actors to be present in some of these areas. So we were able to partner with the UN, with state actors, as well as to one of the questions with the peacekeeping mission, to ensure that there was a security force presence in some of these areas. WFP provided some of the inputs. The local community actually built these community policing areas. We were then able to build communal resources in the form of wells. We set up a conflict management mechanism between the communities to ensure that they understood ownership, access, that they had set up a system that allowed them to, both communities, to be able to utilize these shared resources. And so far, we've been able to ensure that, one, these resources have not been targeted during phases of conflict, that the communities feel a level of ownership of these resources, that they come to not only us, but also the local government to discuss expansion of this. This is just one of the examples of some of these kind of really grassroots initiatives. And I guess this is the benefit and the challenge of this kind of approach. We have huge impact in lives in particular areas, but it's incredibly localized. And what it would take to get that at scale is, one, both costly, but also two, requires a level of analysis across the entire horn and a menu of interventions that go beyond WFP, that go beyond the UN, that may even go beyond our partners at the REC-IGAD, and would involve a whole of government, whole of REC, whole of humanitarian, whole of development kind of approach to have the level of impact that we would need at a national or a state level to replicate what we're seeing at the BOMA level. So I guess one of the conversations that we have to have at the next COPE meeting is what kind of financing is needed to shock-proof this? What kind of financing is needed for adaptation? So as WFP, we've done an incredible amount of work in terms of livestock insurance and crop insurance. But that becomes increasingly difficult when you have fairly frequent patterns of disruption to either crops or livestock deaths. So the question becomes, what is the correct balance between these adaptive mechanisms and these kind of safety net mechanisms that need to be put in place? And what is their appetite and willingness from the donor capitals to fund?
And I think you answered the question from Roll, who wanted a concrete example of a successful strengthening of local institution mediators between communities. Just to come back to you, Chris, a lot to take in here from Kwesi and Linda, and it's clear that if there is local buy-in, if there's community buy-in, if there's buy-in from all the way from, governments down to communities, then early warning systems could really have a potential impact.
Yeah, I think for sure, and the question is, can you kind of go that last mile, and so in terms of, these pastoral conflicts, or between pastoral groups or between farmers and pastoralists, institutions, like ICPAC and the Met departments can, provide pretty good advance, warning of a lot of the shocks, not all of them, but many of them. But then, what you really need to do is prepare ahead of time to use that information. And, one of the things that our group specializes in, is staged early warning systems. And so this is kind of what my drought book is about. And, and part of that is based on providing successive layers of early warning. And so, layer one might be like, oh, there's a La Nina coming, we think there might be a drought. Layer two is, well, based on our, weather forecast for the next couple of weeks, we're pretty sure, like I just was looking, this morning at the rainfall forecast for Somalia and the Bay region, and it looks horrible. And then the next step is using, weather observations and satellite information. And those give you successive layers of ever more refined and localized and accurate early warning. And, that kind of stage system, theoretically, can really be used to guide, local actions that reduce conflict risk. But that takes a lot of dialogue and planning. And I hope that's kind of where we can head, because, conflict is a huge driver of food insecurity, as Dr. Quessy said at the outset of this conversation. And so we really need to do more to reduce it.
Yeah, we had a question here from David about the links between climate change and conflict and cattle herders and raiding over pastures. And David, you're right. We do see that in parts of East Africa, of course, in everywhere from South Sudan, the Karamoja cluster, parts of Ethiopia, parts of northern Kenya. It's nothing new. That we know we've seen kind of cattle rustling for forever. But what we're seeing, I guess, which is new in the region a little bit, is the violence around the cattle raiding, which has become more commercialized, criminalized, with more cross-border, with cattle being a big moneymaker for certain conflict entrepreneurs. So I hope that kind of helps answer your question. There was another question for you here, Linda, from Hubert, who was saying that Linda was speaking about how governments don't have a lot in place in terms of response plans. I'm not sure if you said that, but his suggestion was, are some governments perhaps deliberately capitalizing on impending crises, or basically labeling them as climate responses, but basically weakening rights? I guess what he's kind of asking about is, strong governance, which I think is really important in terms of adaptation and climate adaptation, because if you're going to spend money in certain areas, you're going to need to know that money is going to be well spent, but also there's not going to be maladaptation. I don't know if you're comfortable with coming in there, Linda.
That would be, I don't think there's any data to support that. And I don't know where you would get the data to support that. But I think even in terms of just back to the early warning conversation, I think we, even as a regional institution, are trying to improve the kind of early warning that we give. We're working with WFP on impact, what we're calling impact-based focused. And that has been easy for the agricultural sector, even for the water sector. But where we now need to grow is for the conflict and security sector. So what we're trying to do is partnering with other security institutions to begin to see, or even to create a space to talk about what kind of factors do we need to look for as a climate institutions? What kind of thresholds do the conflict and security sector need, so that to know this is a warning, or this is an issue? And from a quantitative perspective, as a climate center, we thought it was an easy task to do, but more and more, because a lot of it, he's mentioned, has a lot to do with governance issues, a lot to do with historical injustices, has a lot to do with cattle raiding, like you talked about. So there's a lot that we still trying to create an avenue for conversation to happen across its different sectors. And for the first time, we're involving the military and the ministries of defense in this conversation, who have a lot of experience in this area. And when you begin to look at, take more security a bit more seriously, especially for the region, I think the military in even the most fragile countries is one of the largest funded. So even as the military and the defense sectors begin to look at how climate is impacting conflict and security in the region, and we're seeing a lot of political will from the security sector in having these conversations. And the challenge for us then as a climate center, as researchers, is to then, how do we get this climate information from just there's going to be a drought below normal, above normal, to what does it mean in this area for this people? So those are the kind of gaps that we're trying to address, and trying to see, even as a regional institution, can we create an avenue where the different, because when it comes to mandates, and when you talk about climate and conflict, it's a whole group of people who have different mandates, and a lot of them don't have anything to do with one another. So how do you create a forum for this large group of people to sit and begin to talk about what the problem looks like from the different perspectives, but what does a solution look like from the different perspectives as well? So that's what we're trying to do.
I mean, just sticking with the security, military, defense comment that you made there, Linda, Dr. Kwesi, perhaps you could answer this question from Yente about the connection between climate and defense. I mean, he's asking about the impact of defense on climate, emissions from air forces, foreign missions, etc. Large emissions from military infrastructure. I guess in the context where we're working, we have peacekeeping missions, of course, in South Sudan, and we have, ATMIS in Somalia. Do you think that this is something that should be taken into account?
I think this is a really interesting question. I think, yes, I think anything that we can do to reduce our climate and carbon footprint is, of course, welcome. However, I think that one of the things to bear in mind is that outside of Djibouti, there are very few, depending on how you classify foreign, very few foreign military bases. So the footprint is limited. So the question becomes, where can we have the most impact and the most bang for buck? And I think I guess the tragedy of the Horn of Africa is that this is one of the parts of the world with the lowest level of emissions per capita, but one that will be most heavily impacted in terms of the impacts of climate change. So the question then becomes, would it make more sense to close down bases in Europe if we're looking at the impact of climate change? This is just me playing devil's advocate. But I think broader than that, there is a question as to what is needed in terms of adaptations in this region, and how we support governments to kind of approach what is a rather large, complicated, but also quite frightening reality that we're going into. How do we support governments as they make these pretty big decisions around how they need to position themselves and how to protect their citizens going forward? I think that IGAD has done an incredible amount of work with the climate analysis. I think that universities and academia and others like Chris and others have produced large amounts of information. The question becomes, how do we make this digestible for policymakers? Because what we found as WFP is that when we sit across from our government counterparts, they fully understand the impact that climate change is having. In this part of the world, they're seeing it already. Where they may need some support, or where they may come to us for advice or best practice or what has been done elsewhere, is how they can mitigate it. What is it that the donors want to hear in order to release the purse strings? What can be done on the, in some cases, as Linda mentioned, incredibly meager budgets that they have? What can be done with that money to support livelihoods? What can be done to support adaptations? What can be done in particularly in support of climate smart agriculture? I think one of the things with militaries that we need to bear in mind, and I think this is perhaps borne out in many parts of the Horn, is that what we're seeing now in terms of conflict is that you've got communities that are at their most vulnerable already because of climate shocks, are now being exposed to further risks as it relates to either government offensives, armed actors offensives. So in that way, we've got this quite detrimental link between conflict and climate change, just in terms of timing. We've also got the impact of climate change as it forces pastoralists to spend longer times at water points and among farming communities, which leads to conflict. Why do they do this? Simply because of unpredictability. There's no way for them to tell anymore what the next rain season will look like, what the next water point look like. So they tend to stay in areas where they would have left much sooner, much longer. This is a much more erratic pattern. They also arrive sooner than they usually would at times when crops are still on the field. So at this direct causal level, we're seeing an increase in local level conflict, particularly between communities using different modes of production. But on a wider scale, there are a number of other linkages within the chain between climate change and direct conflict.
So great points there, and interesting in terms of what you said, that these peacekeeping missions or forces like ATMIS don't have a great kind of footprint, but at the same time they're very important for addressing the risks and vulnerabilities. And one of the measures that's been taken is Somalia has its first climate security advisor attached to the mission at UNSOM, and South Sudan now as well has a new climate advisor. I guess that is a positive step forward in what we're discussing here. I just wanted to come back to you, Chris, just for some final thoughts, final comments that you might have. You painted, at the beginning of this panel, you painted a pretty grim picture of what we're looking at in terms of the drought in the Horn and what we're seeing on the horizon, a possible sixth failed rainy season. Can you just possibly lay out what your, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but lay out what your predictions are for the coming year, and what that's going to look like for communities who have already gone through 4 failed rainy seasons and a potential 5th coming up, and not just for communities but also for the landscape in this region. What are we talking about here?
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, so just to be, I mean, right now, I think we've moved beyond already a potential 5th poor season to pretty much, I think it's very likely that is going to happen. And because October rains have been, really poor to date, and they're forecast to be poor. And, so it's probably safe to assume that we're looking at already a 5th, poor rainy season. And then, we're working with ICPAC and others to look out to the next season, March, April, May 2023. Linda, I think we're going to have a meeting with ICPAC on that next week to talk about it. And this is an area that I've done a lot of personal research looking at the March, April, May season. And it's a season that has seen a really big decline in rains since 1999, especially when you have had a La Nina event. And what happens is that the Western Pacific Sea surface temperatures become really warm due to interaction of climate change and La Nina, and that increases the probability of drought over East Africa. So, just in terms of counting the number of dry seasons since 1999, there's been below normal rains 47% of the time. And so that is sort of a starting baseline projection. And then when you layer on top of that influences of La Nina in the warm Western Pacific, that increases even further. So I think we are likely to see a sixth drought, even though that's a long way on the horizon. And those repetitive shocks are, like we discussed coming into this, pretty unprecedented. But I would, so we're incredibly concerned about that. But I would like to just circle back to Dr. Kwesi's comments, though, with some words of hope, which is that is really inexpensive to transmit information. In the grand scope of things, it's if you have the systems put together, it doesn't cost very much money to take information from a satellite or a supercomputer and transmit it into somebody's cell phone if you can put the pieces together. And we have the ability to predict the water levels in water holes in Eastern Africa and are setting up systems to do that. We have the ability to monitor the vegetation and to tell pastoralists when the cropping season is over or not. And so the shocks are super concerning, but the opportunities are also there for adaptation.
Thanks, Chris. And Linda, you have 1 minute to sum up.
Thank you, Nazanin. I think from my side, I'll say as IGAD as a whole, what we're trying to do is coordinate better as an institution, because we know that when it comes to climate change, it impacts every aspect of everything. But we have a very siloed approach in terms of how we deal with it. And what we're trying to do as a center is see how can we work together better to solve this problem. And I think, like Dr. Kwesi talked about, moving beyond just as IGAD and just as a humanitarian actors, but involving government and making the table bigger, because the more people that we have trying to work on this, the easier or the quicker it is that we come with a solution. So hopefully moving forward, if we can coordinate better, if we can expand the table, so to speak, so we can have solutions coming even faster.
And it'll be good to have the people who are being impacted on the ground at the table too, the pastoralists who are unable to find pasture and water and desperately searching for it, and also some of the people working in agriculture, rain-fed agriculture, who are suffering from the impacts too. But Kwesi, 30 seconds just to sum up your thoughts on this as we wrap up this event.
Again, thanks for having me. I'd like to say that as WFP, we are working with partners to try to support those who are most impacted by the climate crisis. We're trying to understand better how that impacts people at a local level and use our massive footprint in this Eastern Africa, Horn of Africa region to support those most vulnerable. We can't do it alone. We need greater partnership with others, particularly with the developed states in terms of funding. And again, thanks so much for putting this together, both ICG and Adelphi.
Thanks to Adelphi for organising this great climate security conference. Thanks to all of you who've been listening in. This has been recorded, so for those who haven't been able to stay and watch to the end, you can catch up on YouTube tomorrow. But thank you, everyone, and thanks to our panelists for being so great. Thank you, and bye-bye.